The Vatican is widely regarded as the richest religious organization in existence. Its chapels, basilicas, archives, and galleries contain works of art and sacred objects so valuable that they could compete with the national museums and cultural treasuries of entire countries. Its collections are effectively priceless. Its financial institutions oversee and move billions quietly, discreetly, steadily. Its influence extends from major financial centers and political capitals all the way to struggling villages where people live on almost nothing. But there is a point that most people never pause to confront. This fortune did not appear by miracle. It was not simply inherited as a holy gift. It was assembled through time. It was engineered. It was protected. And just like every large fortune recorded in history, its base was not built only on declarations of faith. It rested on money, on access to rulers, on negotiations, and on arrangements that would likely shock many of the very believers whose devotion helped generate it. What follows is not a sermon, and it is not a theological debate. It is an economic analysis. Because the economic story of the Vatican is the story of how a spiritual movement that began at the margins of power transformed into a global financial institution, and how, step by step, money became inseparable from organized religion's ability to survive, to expand, and to dominate. The timeline begins at a moment when everything changed for Christianity. The instant it stopped being illegal. In the year 313 after Christ, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. This decree officially legalized Christianity within the Roman Empire, bringing an end to cycles of persecution that Christians had endured for generations. Overnight, a religion that had survived in house gatherings, in private spaces, always under the threat of arrest, torture, or execution, was elevated to a status that carried state protection. And with recognition came material reward. Members of the aristocratic class began donating land. Imperial figures and wealthy Roman families directed vast gifts toward the church. Emperors, starting with Constantine himself, granted privileges and poured resources into the new faith. Constantine personally financed the building of the first St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, making it clear that the church was not just spiritually endorsed, but materially sponsored. The message was unmistakable. Holiness and visible wealth could be aligned. From that point forward, the church absorbed a permanent lesson that empires already knew very well. Financial capital creates authority, and authority allows you to gather more financial capital. Moving into the early Middle Ages, the church perfected one of its first great systems of consistent income, the tithe. The tithe was not presented as a suggestion. It was not framed as casual charity. It was framed as obligation. Every Christian was expected to give 1/10, 10%, of their earnings or their harvest to the church. That could be grain, livestock, wine, money, depending on the local economy. And failing to meet that requirement was not portrayed as simply breaking a rule. It was portrayed as endangering your soul. That is how the tithe functioned. It was essentially a tax, but it was enforced through spiritual pressure instead of secular police in its early form. The flow of wealth gathered through this practice moved upward in a structured chain. A local parish collected from the people in its area. Those resources, in part, went on to bishops. From there, portions continued to ascend toward higher levels, and ultimately supported Rome. Imagine the reality for a medieval farmer, barely producing enough to sustain a family through a long winter, still being required to relinquish 1/10 of that hard-earned crop, or be told that spiritual danger awaited. That one mechanism alone generated a steady current of wealth, year after year, generation after generation. The long-term effect was staggering. Over centuries, with tithes accumulating, with noble families leaving property to the church in their wills, with estates being handed over as gestures of piety or as insurance for the afterlife, the church grew into the dominant landholding force in Western Europe. By around the year 1000, estimates indicate that the Catholic Church controlled nearly 1/3 of all land in that region. That is not an exaggeration. We are not only talking about majestic cathedrals, isolated monasteries, or inner-city churches. We are talking about pasture land, wheat fields, vineyards, water mills, and entire forests. These were not symbolic assets. They were productive assets. They generated crops, rents, and raw materials. They produced wealth on their own, long before modern banking instruments existed, in a world where control of land equaled survival, food, leverage, and political standing. The church sat at the top of that system. It had become, in practical terms, not just a religious power, but a feudal power. But land and tithes were not the end of the story. The machine did not stop there. Over time, the church discovered even more aggressive ways to convert fear and devotion into financial gain. By the 11th century, the church had weaponized and spread one of its most profitable instruments, the indulgence. The sales logic behind indulgences was brilliant and ruthless. The church taught that sins carried punishment after death, punishment that would be experienced in purgatory. An indulgence, the church said, could reduce that punishment, either for you personally or for someone you loved who had already died. In plain terms, you gave money to the church, and in exchange, you received official recognition that a portion of spiritual penalty had been lifted. It was marketed as mercy. Functionally, it was salvation sold as a product. The indulgence system generated a flood of revenue. That money did not just go toward candles and hymnals. It financed the political and military ambitions of the church, because by that point, the church was no longer simply a network of clergy and local communities. It operated like a major force in European geopolitics. This was the world in which the Crusades began in 1096. The Crusades are often remembered in religious terms, as holy wars launched in the name of faith. But they were also massive financial operations that required enormous funding. Armies marching across continents do not feed and equip themselves. Someone has to pay. To support these campaigns, the church imposed new forms of taxation, and when certain people could not physically go fight, indulgences were offered as an alternative path. You could contribute money instead of your body and be told that you had served the holy cause. As crusading forces captured cities and territories, victory did not just produce symbolic glory. It produced material gains. Gold, relics, rare objects, and land were seized and redirected. Control over territories meant control over rents and resources. The papacy benefited from that redistribution. By the close of the Crusades, the Vatican stood not only as a spiritual authority, but also as a force with military reach and financial leverage on a level comparable to kings. And back in everyday life, the contradiction was already visible. Priests preached humility, warned about pride and greed, and demanded that ordinary people live modestly. Meanwhile, the church as an institution was amassing more property, extracting more payment, and exerting more control than almost any monarch in Europe. The pattern is familiar. The public message aimed at the masses is morality and sacrifice, while the private machinery is extraction and accumulation. As history moved into the late Middle Ages and then into the Renaissance, the Vatican's role expanded even further. It was no longer just a land baron. It had become an active financial power. The Pope was not only depicted as the shepherd of souls, he acted like a sovereign ruler. He commanded territories. He managed political alliances. He had a court. He needed revenue not only for basic religious functions, but for diplomatic maneuvering, patronage, armed defense, and cultural dominance. Wealth became a requirement for survival at that level of politics. The Vatican was expected, by itself and by others, to project magnificence. Nothing represented that drive for magnificence more than the push to replace the aging St. Peter's Basilica. The original basilica, which Constantine had sponsored centuries earlier, was deteriorating and no longer reflected the kind of visual supremacy the papacy wanted to display in the 1500s. The goal was not a modest renovation. The goal was a cathedral so large and so visually overwhelming that no other site in Christianity could compete with it. But that kind of monument requires an extraordinary budget. And to fund it, the Vatican increased its dependency on indulgences even more. Preachers traveled across Europe selling signed documents that promised to reduce the suffering of souls in purgatory. This was not subtle. It was direct emotional pressure. People were told that their dead relatives were in pain, and that this pain could be eased if they paid. One Dominican friar, Johann Tetzel, became infamous for the way he pitched indulgences to the public. His line has echoed through the centuries. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The message behind that slogan was unmistakable. A simple payment, a single coin, could supposedly free a soul from torment. Families with almost nothing still handed over what little they had, believing they were buying spiritual relief for the people they loved. The enormous sums collected in these campaigns did not only go to architects and stonecutters working on St. Peter's, they also supported the papal lifestyle. Renaissance popes lived like secular princes. Alexander VI, a member of the Borgia family, became notorious for nepotism, self-interest, and personal scandal. Leo X, from the powerful Medici banking dynasty, poured huge amounts of wealth into art, spectacles, and elite festivities even while the residents of Rome went hungry. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. On one side, sermons condemned greed. On the other, the papal court displayed extravagance so intense that even European monarchs were jealous. The Church publicly praised poverty and modesty as virtues. But at the heart of the institution, luxury was being used as a symbol of authority and divine favor. Behind these displays, another transformation had already taken place. The Vatican had embraced banking. Official doctrine still condemned usury, the charging of interest on loans, as a sin. But in practice, the papacy worked hand in hand with the powerful banking families of Italy, including houses like the Lombards and the Medicis. The Church relied on these networks to move money discreetly, to safeguard funds, and to multiply resources. The papal court evolved into a central financial node. It managed church revenue streams, yes, but it also became entangled in the personal debts and obligations of kings. Monarchs owed money to bankers. Bankers needed papal favor. The Vatican sat at the center of this network like a spider in a web, surrounded by threads of loyalty, debt, and dependence. But systems built on this kind of pressure and secrecy always run the risk of backlash. That backlash arrived. In 1517, Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk in Germany, made his protest public. He wrote and posted his 95 Theses, challenging church practices, and went after indulgences as a core abuse. He argued that the idea of purchasing forgiveness was a deception, that salvation was not a commodity that could be bought, and that the enormous wealth of Rome had been piled up through exploitation of the fearful and the poor. Luther's challenge lit the fuse of the Reformation. The result was an earthquake. Europe split. Entire nations broke from Rome's authority and rejected papal control. Almost overnight, indulgences, which had been the Vatican's great money machine and the cash pipeline behind the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, became a symbol of corruption, so obvious and so offensive that people were willing to tear down centuries of religious unity over it. There is a deep irony there. The money-raising scheme that financed the Vatican's most glorious architectural project also ignited the revolt that permanently shattered its uncontested hold over Western Christianity. Wealth had created splendor, and that splendor helped project control. But the way that wealth was gathered also cultivated rage and disillusionment. And that kind of resentment, once it spreads broadly enough to cause entire regions to defect, is not something that any empire can fully negotiate away. By the 1600s, the Vatican continued to possess land, assets, and influence, but it had lost its aura of absolute, unchallenged authority. The Reformation had left scars. The papacy's prestige was damaged. The Church could no longer speak with the same unquestioned dominance across Europe. Still, one thing did not change: the model. The pattern of using faith as the public face and finance as the hidden engine did not disappear. It adapted. The Church continued to operate with a dual structure. On the surface, it offered spiritual certainty and moral instruction. Underneath, it maintained and defended mechanisms that converted devotion into revenue and power. Even after losing millions of followers and whole territories to competing branches of Christianity, the Vatican did not surrender the habit of managing belief as a source of income. For many centuries, the Church's wealth had come from land ownership, from compulsory tithes, and from indulgence money. But then, in the 19th century, that arrangement was violently disrupted. Up to that point, the Vatican did not only lead spiritually, it directly governed a stretch of territory known as the Papal States, covering large regions in central Italy. These lands delivered rent, agricultural income, and tax revenue. They gave the Pope military backing and political leverage. They made the papacy not only a religious presence, but a territorial ruler with literal armies and borders. That changed in 1870. As the Italian peninsula unified into a single nation, the Papal States were taken and absorbed into the new Italian state. In a single blow, the Pope lost direct control over those lands, and with that loss went the steady streams of income and the hard political authority that came from being a landholding ruler. From the outside, it looked like a collapse. The church seemed suddenly cut down from a territorial empire to a mostly spiritual seat. Many people at the time predicted that its financial strength was effectively finished, but a structure that has spent centuries learning how to monetize belief does not simply accept defeat. It searches for a new strategy. The Vatican did exactly that in the 20th century. Its resurrection came through a political deal in 1929 known as the Lateran Treaty. Benito Mussolini, who led fascist Italy and needed the Vatican's support to strengthen his own legitimacy, negotiated directly with the papacy. The treaty did more than recognize Vatican City as an independent sovereign state. It also granted the church a massive financial settlement, meant to compensate for the land it had lost decades earlier. The package included 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in government bonds. Adjusted to modern value, that payout translates to billions of dollars. In plain terms, it was a rescue package. Mussolini secured the church's cooperation and moral backing. In exchange, the Vatican received enough money to rebuild its financial base almost overnight. With this new capital, the Vatican established a modern institutional tool, the Institute for Religious Works, commonly referred to as the Vatican Bank. Officially, its purpose was to manage funds belonging to religious orders and Catholic charities. Officially, it was about service, stewardship, and piety-driven finance. In practice, it became a protected financial hub with unusual levels of secrecy and independence. Because it existed within a sovereign city-state, it could operate beyond many normal forms of external regulation. That gave it the flexibility to move money discreetly, to invest strategically, and to exert influence far beyond the physical size of Vatican City. Over the decades that followed, especially during the Cold War, Vatican funds were directed into political causes, including anti-communist efforts. By the 1980s, the Vatican Bank was tied to one of the most notorious financial scandals of that era, centered on Banco Ambrosiano. In that scandal, huge amounts of money disappeared. Roberto Calvi, a banker with deep Vatican connections who became known in the press as God's banker, was found dead under Blackfriars Bridge in London, hanging with bricks stuffed into his pockets. His death was eventually ruled a murder. The fallout linked the Vatican Bank in public perception to allegations of mafia involvement, covert intelligence connections, and money laundering schemes. Those associations damaged the Vatican Bank's reputation and have lingered ever since, casting a long shadow around the claim that this was purely an institution of religious charity. The contrast is almost brutal. An institution that publicly calls for humility and poverty had, by this point, mastered high-level finance to a degree that rivaled some of the most sophisticated corporations and political entities in the world. It had built its first fortune through land control, through mandatory tithes, through indulgences sold as spiritual relief. It had restored that fortune through political negotiation and massive state compensation. Then, it protected that fortune through a bank operating inside a sovereign microstate, with secrecy as one of its core shields. And even when scandal exploded, from Banco Ambrosiano to allegations of laundering dirty money, the Vatican remained insulated by its sacred status. It existed in a position that can be summarized in one phrase: too holy to fail. Today, no one outside the inner structure can state with precision how much the Vatican is worth. The true number is obscured by layers of entities, accounts, properties, and protections. Its art collections alone, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo, the rooms decorated by Raphael, are effectively beyond calculation. These works cannot realistically be sold, but they represent billions in cultural and financial value. The Vatican also controls land and investments through its internal institutions, yet those holdings are often shielded from full public scrutiny. On paper, the Vatican releases budgets that look restrained and humble. It projects the image of a small city-state managing limited resources. But anyone who studies the historical pattern understands that appearances can be curated. The display of modest numbers can itself function as a tool, helping to maintain moral authority while quietly protecting assets. Which brings us to the core lesson. The Vatican's wealth was not a divine accident. It was constructed methodically. It was enforced. It was restructured again and again to survive political changes. It was funded by tithes that acted like religious taxes. It was supported by vast landholdings. It was powered by indulgences, which turned fear of eternal punishment into cash flow. It was defended through alliances with emperors, kings, and, later, modern dictators. It was revived through a treaty in 1929 that delivered a huge payout. It was modernized through a bank that could move money in the shadows. Over and over, belief was converted into revenue, and revenue was converted into power. And that last point matters beyond religion. This is not only a story about the Catholic Church. It is a map for understanding how power operates anywhere. The Vatican is not a strange exception. It is a clear example of a repeating pattern. When a government promises that its currency is strong, while simultaneously printing more and more of it, it is asking people to accept faith in a story while the underlying math erodes. When a corporation announces its devotion to values and ethics while quietly cutting wages and forcing more work out of fewer workers, it is doing exactly what the medieval church did, presenting virtue in public while extracting in private. When a bank tells depositors that their savings are completely safe while using those same deposits to take on risky positions for profit, it is playing the same game. The script is constant. On the outside, reassurances, morality, promises. On the inside, accounting, leverage, control. So, when you look at the marble floors and the golden altars of the Vatican, you are not only looking at religion, you are looking at one of the oldest surviving demonstrations of how institutional wealth is gathered, justified, concealed, and defended. You are looking at how a system can present itself as pure while acting with the cold precision of any empire. Wealth assembled in private almost always wraps itself in the language of virtue. Respectability becomes armor. Righteousness becomes a brand. That combination is powerful. It convinces people to keep feeding the system that extracts from them. The takeaway is direct. The structures that ask for loyalty will nearly always describe that loyalty as noble. They will frame obedience as moral duty. They will insist that the resources they take are necessary for the greater good. And then, behind that language, they will manage those resources like any other empire, guarding them, investing them, and using them to preserve their own survival. This dynamic is not just medieval. It is active anywhere you are told that you must trust a system automatically, and that questioning that system is disloyal or dangerous. Seeing that pattern does not require abandoning belief. It requires recognizing how belief is turned into capital, and who benefits from that conversion. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.